When we look at who was involved in the Willowbrook study, the most important group to focus on is the children. These were children with intellectual and developmental disabilities living at the Willowbrook State School, many of whom had little to no ability to advocate for themselves. On the other side were the researchers, including pediatrician Saul Krugman, who led the study. They were seen as trusted medical professionals, which made it easier for parents to rely on their judgment. And then there were also the parents and guardians. Many of them were in really difficult situations, trying to find care for their children in an overcrowded system. In some cases, they felt pressured to consent to the study in order to secure their admission, which raises serious concerns about whether that consent was truly voluntary. What actually happened at Willowbrook is honestly pretty unsettling. Researchers were trying to better understand hepatitis, but instead of just observing cases that were already happening, they intentionally infected children with the virus. In some cases, this meant giving them material that was contaminated with hepatitis or injecting it directly, just so they could track how the disease developed. The justification at the time was that hepatitis was already spreading throughout the facility, so researchers believed they were simply studying something that was inevitable. But the reality is, they weren't just observing it, they were actively causing it, especially in children who may not have gotten sick at that point. What makes this even more concerning is that many of these children were newly admitted, and families were often put into a position where agreeing to the study made it easier to secure placement in the overcrowded institution. So even though it was presented as research, it really crossed a major line. Instead of protecting a vulnerable population, the study ended up exploiting them in the name of science. This study took place at the Willowbrook State School, a state-run institution for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. At the time, Willowbrook was extremely overcrowded and understaffed, with poor living conditions that made the spread of infection, especially hepatitis, very common. Because of these conditions, the facility became the primary setting for the research. Instead of improving the environment or protecting the children, the institution was used as a place to carry out the study, which ultimately contributed to the ethical concerns surrounding what happened there. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Studies took place from the mid-1950s through the early 1970s, a time when ethical guidelines for human research were still developing and not as strictly enforced as they are today. This was before many of the protections we now rely on, like strict informed consent processes and oversight by ethical committees. Because of that, studies like this were able to continue for years, even as serious ethical concerns were present. The researchers believed they were working toward a greater good. Their goal was to better understand hepatitis, how it spreads, how it affects the body, and how immunity might develop, so they could eventually help prevent and treat the disease. They justified the study by saying hepatitis was already very common at the Willowbrook State School, so in their view, they were studying something that was unavoidable. However, this reasoning ignored a key issue. Instead of protecting the children, they chose to deliberately expose them to harm, which is what makes the study so ethically problematic.
Should medical researchers be restricted by ethics? Krugman's research study of infectious hepatitis at Willowbrook State School was supported by the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene, as well as the Armed Forces Epidemiologic Board of the Office of Surgeon General, the U.S. Army. Interest in understanding the transmission and severity of infectious hepatitis was widespread in the scientific community and military in the 1950s and 60s. Insights into viral infections produced by Willowbrook Hepatitis Studies were well received by many scientists. Ethical responsibility in research studies. While many scientists lauded Saul Krugman for his exploration of infectious hepatitis, some were outraged. Henry Beecher, chief anesthesiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, took issue with the lack of explanation given to parents at the time of informed consent for Willowbrook hepatitis studies. What galled Dr. Beecher was the lack of any real informed consent and the willingness to cause harm to subjects without the possibility of benefiting these individuals for the sake of science.
Okay, the main ethical principles violated within the Willowbrook study were respect for persons, beneficence, which means doing good for the patient, non-maleficence, which means do no harm, and justice, which means fairness. The children involved were very vulnerable and could not fully protect their own rights. The researchers caused harm instead of preventing it by intentionally exposing them to hepatitis. It was also unjust because the burden of the study was placed on institutionalized children with intellectual disabilities. And needless to say, they had very little power or choice over what was going on.
When ethics in clinical research by Dr. Beecher was rejected by his peers, Dr. Beecher persisted in publicizing his disapproval of the consent used to intentionally infect disabled children with hepatitis to determine the period of infectivity. The Belmont Report, released in 1978 and published to the Federal Register in 1979, established principles guiding federal oversight of clinical research, including respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. In 1981, common rule law passed, requiring institutional review boards to approve research studies that involve human subjects.
Now, why does this study matter? The reason this study matters is because it helped shape the ethical rules we use in research today. It showed how important informed consent is, which is clearly explaining the study's risks and giving people the real choice. It also showed why vulnerable populations need extra protection. Today, studies must go through IRB reviews, and IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, which is a committee that checks if research is safe, fair, and ethical. Most importantly, this case reminds us that research should never come before human life, dignity, and safety. In conclusion, the Willowbrook study is one of the clearest examples of unethical research involving human subjects. Even though the researchers claimed they were trying to better understand hepatitis, the way they studied what was done was harmful and unfair. The case had a lasting impact on healthcare and on research ethics. Today, it stands as a reminder that protecting people must always come before any goals of science. Thanks.